Okay, good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Daily Energy Markets podcast. It is the last day of October, Halloween, October the 31st. I'm delighted to be joined today by Robin Mills, CEO of Qamar Energy, David Fife, Chief Economist of Argus Media, and Frank Kane, Editor-at-Large of Arabian Gulf Business Insight. Welcome and good morning, gentlemen. Frank, let's start with you because you're sitting there at the Future Investment Initiative Summit in Riyadh, Davos of the Desert, in its final day, I believe. Let's ask you for your sort of top three takeaways that you would leave Riyadh on, perhaps today or tomorrow, on your journey back to Dubai. What struck you most there?
Right. Well, this is the eighth FII, and I've been to all of them. And I have to say that this is the most impressive so far. There just seems to be a real variety of different subjects that are being discussed here. They really seem to have hit the right note and the right tone with this event. I filed a column for Arabian Gulf Business Insight earlier in the week where I said that the elephant in the plenary hall was the US presidential election. And that would certainly be my top takeaway, I think, because while it hasn't been officially on any of the agenda items, the agenda schedule, it has been much talked about, and various people have strayed from their subjects on the stage to actually talk about it. And the top line is not very surprising, but people here think that Trump is going to win, and they think that is rather a good thing for the US-Saudi relationship, and also they think it's a good thing for American business. There are some doubts about whether it's a good thing for oil markets. That was kind of tangentially discussed on the sidelines. And then there was to kind of reinforce that impression, there was a formal vote in the audience in the plenary hall yesterday, where 67% of respondents said that Trump would win. So that's rather a big majority. But that has certainly been the main takeaway as far as I'm concerned here. Elon Musk put in a show on the evening of the first day, where he said that he was quite blatant about it. He said, "I'm very busy now because of the election, like a seasoned campaigner that he is, So I guess the U.S. election is my top takeaway. The oil market too has been discussed. Amin Nasser was on a panel yesterday where he said that Q4 demand for oil would be 106 million barrels a day. 106.5 million barrels a day, which is rather more than OPEC, even OPEC are predicting. That was an interesting top line from him. Prince Abdulaziz delivered a very long, detailed 30-slide PowerPoint presentation on day one, which basically set out the fundamental Saudi position on oil, energy, climate change, hydrogen, everything else, and a very long exposition, if you like.
Did he? I'll just interrupt you just quick, and I'll come back to you on a few of those points also, Frank. But did Prince Abdulaziz hint at all at what they're going to do in a month's time? Did he reinforce that message or didn't mention it?
No, he wasn't asked, and he didn't give any public statement. Okay. He said the kind of headline that I took away from it was Saudi Arabia is going to monetize the last barrel of oil in the kingdom. So, straight down the line commitment to carry on producing regardless.
Okay, well, let me come back to you on a few of those points. Robin, let me go to you on one or two. Let's stay sort of Saudi or OPEC focused, because, in a month's time, they're planning to increase incremental volumes onto the market. We've had a lot of people on the last week or two saying, will they, won't they? And again, a 50-50 sort of split on what impact that would have. If they don't go ahead, it loses credibility. If they do go ahead, people saying on the fundamentals, they cannot afford to. There's just too much supply coming from elsewhere. Demand hasn't changed. What do you think they'll do? And what do you think will happen if they do proceed with their plan?
Robin?
Yeah, I mean, more chatter recently, as you say, that they may yet again postpone the increase. I think that's been becoming, from the Saudi point of view, increasingly difficult as time goes on, because you ask the question, when are they ever going to increase production? Especially with the balances for next year, looking like a surplus as well. And as Frank says, I mean, NASA giving quite a bullish view on Chinese demand at least, and again, I don't think the OPEC members are really going by the OPEC forecasts anymore, but the OPEC forecast itself also, has been trimmed a little bit, but still looks pretty bullish, far more bullish, obviously, than most other analysts and the IEA and so on. I think what one factor there is it depends on the view of the Saudis on their OPEC colleagues, and particularly countries like Iraq, and how well are they living up to their promises on compliance and compensation. Iraqi production has fallen. It's still above target, and definitely above target, including the compensation cuts. But is that enough to satisfy the Saudis that Iraq is kind of doing its best? Because I think there were definitely hints last month that the Saudis were in position to, or of a mind to start punishing Iraq and the others for not complying enough, and were therefore willing to go ahead with the production increases and said, okay, we'll leave it to December, but no more. And if we don't see better compliance, then definitely production is going up in December, and that will hurt those who haven't been living up to their commitments.
Okay, so I mean, that'll hurt those who haven't, it could deal with this of an internal dynamics of OPEC. But David, let me go to you on that, because again, just to repeat the point, that if Saudi does proceed, and not so much in December, but into next year, by adding those volumes, let's say, continues to commit to that, to punish others, or just because it wants to maintain credibility as being in control, many people are saying we could see oil prices in the 50s, no doubt. Demand projections for next year, there doesn't seem to be a lot of doubt as to what that's going to be, taking into account China, etc. Would you agree with that point of view? And can this, and I'll go back later to Frank and ask whether the Saudis would accept that price going to the 50s. But do you think that there is that reality on the ground?
I do, actually. Our view is that next year, if they proceed with this tapering of the voluntary portion of output cuts, we're headed for a sort of global surplus of something around 1.5 million barrels per day. But I think, the messaging is just almost as important as the physical reality. The market at the moment is of the opinion that we're not going to see, an expansion of the conflict between Israel and Iran, or at least that it will remain contained and won't target energy infrastructure. And of course, that's a huge assumption. We don't know what's going to happen over the next 6 months in that simmering conflict. But absent a sort of a support from a geopolitical event, to my mind, it's almost a no-brainer that, they, from a market perspective, they should be deferring, and they should be announcing early that they're going to put in a 3-month, a 6-month deferral of returns of those barrels. But of course, I absolutely acknowledge what Robin was saying. There are difficulties there. There's a lot of producers chafing at the bit, who feel they've been restraining output for long enough. We've got a situation where in China and India, Middle Eastern barrels are being displaced by Iranian barrels on the one hand, Russian barrels on the other. And at what point does patience snap with that, and prevent the rolling through of the production restraint that we've seen so far, which, to be fair, has been a pretty impressive performance, and certainly has put a floor under prices in the midst of fairly anemic levels of oil demand growth.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the policy by OPEC, led by Saudi, obviously has been deemed a success. Saving, let's say, the oil price so far, and obviously with certain people sacrificing market share. But again, how long can that go on for? Is the patience running out? Frank, back to you. One announcement that came out of the conference there in Riyadh a couple of days ago was that Saudi is planning to refocus more towards inwards, in country, investment. It's not going to
Yeah.
abandon its external, but the proportion of the PIF's big fund is going to be whittled, back about 20% from outside to inside in terms of allocation.
Yeah.
What I mean, has that been talked about? And what does that mean, do you think, for what they're thinking about the oil price? At the end of the day, that's their revenue, right? Whether they're spending inside or outside. Do you think that relaxes their viewpoint towards the oil price, or does the opposite?
Well, I think it shows their priorities, and I think it also shows that low volumes and low prices are hurting the Saudi economy. Last year the Saudi economy was in recession, technical recession. It will pull out of it this year, by all accounts. But this was the big talking point from day one. The Public Investment Fund said that it was reducing the percentage of international investment compared to domestic investment. I mean, it's only down by 1 or 2%. But even so, that shows a different approach. Yasser Al-Rumayyan, the governor, also made the point when he announced this. He also made the point that because the fund is growing fast and is almost at the $1 trillion level now, that the absolute amount of investment in international assets is, of course, increasing all the time. So that's still going up in absolute terms. But it certainly does show priorities, doesn't it?
And why? Why do you think they've reprioritized?
Because they have, some very big ticket domestic items that require funding, like Expo 2030, like the World Cup in 2034. These are things that they hadn't really factored in when they drew up Vision 2030 back in 2017-18. They didn't know that they were doing these things as well. And these are all multi-billion-dollar projects, that have to be paid for, and they're on a deadline. Vision 2030 can be allowed to slip, but these are solid events that have to take place, in those years. So the place has to be ready. I mean, I must say that traveling around Riyadh, there was a huge amount of infrastructure work going on. New roads, the metro, which I know we've been talking about, for years and years. You do actually see metro cars, trundling along on overhead trials now. There really is a huge amount of building construction and infrastructure development going on. So all that's being paid for too. All that has to be paid for. So you mentioned oil at $50 bucks. Well, of course they wouldn't like that. But that may be what is necessary to kind of correct the misshapen nature, as I see it, of OPEC plus. Now you have these people who are overproducing.
Yeah, and also, I mean, if they're willing to take that hit to the 50s, also it'll correct some of the non-OPEC participation, presumably as well, because as a cost that becomes a bit more of a factor there. Thanks, Frank. Robin, let me go to you a bit about, I mean, we don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of the US election too much, but again, get your point of view on in terms of how the result of that might impact the Middle East from a sanctions point of view, for example, on Iran, and I mean the conflict. Trump is a deal maker, but I don't know what deal he could do at this point. But we've seen things calm down between Israel and Iran, and that is what the market is certainly pricing in at the moment. That's not going to escalate any further. What difference do you think it'll make to the oil price, to policy, if we see Trump or Harris come in?
Sure. And I'll answer that, Diallo, but I just wanted to come back briefly on Frank's points, which I think are great points. Just two things there. If the Saudis want to produce the last barrel of oil in the kingdom, and they don't want to produce that in 200 years' time, but in something a little bit sooner, they need to be increasing production, at some point and reasonably soon. And 2034, for as you mentioned, these big events, 2030 and 2034, that's 10 years away now, 2034, obviously. We're 8 years into the vision so far. So it's a bit more than the time we've had so far. That is plenty of time to have a reconfiguration of the oil market, to have a period of low prices, to sweat out some of the competition, and to get Saudi production back on a rising trajectory. So it's a couple of kind of points about how they support the long-term vision, I think, with the oil market. But to come back on your question there about the about the impact of the election, look, I think there's a lot of it, a huge amount of attention on the US election by the energy industry. I think what I feel about this is that whatever Trump or Harris would do for the energy industry in terms of legislation and so on is really minor compared to what either of them, particularly Trump, would do for the economy and for the geopolitical scene. That will have much more impact on the energy industry indirectly than anything they do with fiddling around with methane regulations in the Permian or any kind of domestic things like that. And the domestic and the international question is absolutely critical. What would Trump in particular mean for the Middle East and for the conflicts here? And I can only think that we'd see a major escalation of pressure on Iran, more encouragement for the Israelis to keep testing Iranian limits, and maybe to try from their point of view to settle that Iranian question once and for all, with the thought that the US may well get drawn into that. And then, of course, we have then stars really open up, and who knows where we go in terms of conflict and threats to energy infrastructure and so on. We shrug off how bad it's been, but I think that the Red Sea has been effectively closed for a year now, and the market's kind of lives with that okay. I mean, that just kind of seems remarkable. One of the key arteries of world trade is now, and oil trade and LNG trade is now hardly used, and yet we kind of go on like that's normal. And just think how bad things could get in terms of a much more open conflict.
Yeah. But I mean, as you said, the industry is very adaptable. David, let's go back to a couple of the points that you touched on, which is, we're talking about demand outlook, China in particular. Next year, by all accounts, demand growth is going to be much lower than it was even, this year. So that is a reality now that the market's accepting. We've had a lot of talk about the EV EV sort of demand eating into the gasoline demand that China might have, the LNG trucking, etc. And refiners wanting to sort of buy spot oil rather than term oil from suppliers like Aramco. Do you think we really are now going to be transitioning to that new very solid reality from a reliance sort of on China demand point of view?
Well, I think the first point to make about China is that the major conundrum they have is that the consumer is not spending. The consumer has been hit extraordinarily hard by the collapse of the real estate sector. 60–70% of savings in China are tied up in the property sector. Investment in real estate is declining month after month after month at a rate of about 10% annually. So the Chinese consumer is very nervous about spending. To a certain extent, the authorities they're moving ahead with stimulus on both a monetary and a fiscal standpoint. The big question is, can they entice the Chinese consumer to get back to spending again? Now, our view of Chinese oil demand for this year is that it's actually in aggregate contraction of about 180,000 barrels a day. That's our view of demand this year. Now, I don't necessarily think that is, set in for the short-term future. I think we may move back into modest growth of something around 200,000 to 300,000 barrels per day next year, assuming that the sort of dribbling of stimulus into the economy has something of an impact. But they've really got a major issue with the collapse of the real estate sector. And structurally, as we know, China has to make that move to make consumers more confident, to put in the sort of social safety nets that they need to be confident to start traveling again, in terms of tourism, in terms of spending on big ticket issues. Our view actually is, going back to the US election, paradoxically, is that if we get major tariffs from a Trump administration, which, by the way, I think it would be pretty disastrous both for the US and the global economy. But
that is expected. He's expected to get.
It is expected,
tariffs.
but one of the upshots of it is that it may get the Chinese to double down in terms of the deployment of renewables and EVs in the domestic market. So over the next 5 years, it could further eat into Chinese oil demand growth going forward. And you're likely to see Chinese oil demand growth become eclipsed by not India on its own, but probably India and Southeast Asia together start to outstrip the growth that we see annually in oil demand out of China.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it'll have an impact on oil demand because of trade being hampered. So even that sort of aggregate, sort of less ships sailing because of trade, you never know. So certainly that would, and I wonder what Trump would what sort of approach he would take if he knew that would be the impact.
I mean, there's a slight irony here because I suspect he'd like to lift the moratorium on LNG export facility construction that was put in place by Biden. But, and that has the potential to lift domestic US gas prices, domestic US gas production. But the flip side of the coin is his tariffs potentially get people backing away from purchasing US LNG. So there's a double-edged sword at work there.
Thanks, David. Okay, well, let's look at that survey question, which addresses what we've been talking about. Saudi Arabia's declared pivot to focus a bit more on in-country investment will add pressure to maintain a specific oil price floor. Will that add pressure or take it away? Do you agree that it will add pressure or not? Or does it perhaps relieve some of that? We'll have a look at that later. Frank, while you've been there in Saudi, obviously things being declared on stage, conversations happening off stage, any takeaway you'd get from the sort of Iran-Saudi rapprochement that was happening until recently and perhaps is still happening behind closed doors? Any sort of takeaway on that? I mean, again, we've had people say if Trump wins, Saudis will be happy. If Harris wins, Iran will be happy. And yet those two countries are also supposedly trying to keep the peace.
Yeah, well, it has been discussed, not that prominently on stage, but it's one of the big topics in the corridors, etc. I mean, one point about Trump and the Arab attitude towards Trump, why they like him, it seems to be that they think he will bring peace. That Trump is a peacemaker, and that's what they want. That's been his whole appeal to American Arabs in Michigan in particular, and that's also the feeling here. But when you say to them, but look, he will bring peace at the price of Palestine, really, because he is heavily pro-Israel, they don't really seem to have thought that one through. Sorry, that's a little diversion. But Iran has been a topic for sure. I don't think there's any, great willingness to stray away from the kind of rapprochement that we've seen between Saudi and Iran. There's been some talk here about technology and military uses of technology. One panel yesterday said, well, it's all drones these days, isn't it? And Saudi Arabia is well placed in the military drone field. And if Iran ever attacked again, like it did in 2019, Saudi could retaliate significantly. So it is a kind of subject, but I don't think there's any, huge straying from the official line, that had, a kind of slow and gentle peace. One other point, there's also going on in Riyadh this week, intergovernmental Arab summit on Palestine and a two-state solution, trying to reinforce that, which is the official Saudi position. That's been very behind closed doors. No media has been allowed or anything. But that is happening at the same time.
Which governments are participating?
GCC and wider Middle East, Arab governments in general, and there may be some input too from Americans. Hochstein is in Beirut, isn't he? Today, I believe. or Israel.
Good luck to
that
them.
that's
I
kind of
think
going in the background.
Yeah, still going on the background and achieving nothing by the looks of it in
Well,
terms
yeah,
of seeing an end to this disaster. Thanks, Frank, for that. Robin, back to you. Let's talking about Saudi a little bit, and we have had again in terms of the greater sort of context of their oil policy squeezing the last revenue out of the last barrel, but also Saudi's been shifting quite purposefully to focus on its gas, hasn't it? I mean, it has been making those new sort of recommitments, new commitments to the gas future. Is that happening? Do you think that's going to be a more serious, again, from an expenditure point of view, again, some of this internal expenditure going towards that as well, while it squeezes out the last barrel of oil?
Yeah, they have this target, 50% gas, 50% renewables in the power sector. And I think our view is that on the current trajectory, they're close, a little bit short, but well on the way. The renewables delivery has really picked up. Again, not quite where they need to be, but getting much closer. The gas side also, and that, of course, as you say, will displace ultimately 1 million plus barrels per day of crude and fuel oil from the power sector. Now, there actually are a bunch of pretty new oil-fired power plants. So it's kind of doubtful. I think they'll actually decommission those immediately. So probably they'll remain some more in the power sector, but still, multiple 100,000 barrels per day of internal demand then freed up. And of course, the gas development, particularly Jafurah, brings huge amounts of condensate NGLs with it. So the effective Saudi exports, even regardless of the crude side, effective Saudi exports, we would expect to be going up significantly, including the crude and condensate side. So that kind of partly offsets what they're doing or any struggles they're having on raising the crude production. I mean, that weighs on the market indirectly, but doesn't feature in the OPEC quota, of course.
Yeah, no, but there's a lot of talk about those NGLs and other volumes that are out there that sometimes, again, certain agencies aren't necessarily accounting for or accounting differently. And hence, we see that diversion sometimes on forecasts, even of supply versus demand. Thanks, Robin. David, back to you, perhaps, for last comments. Again, talking about, I mean, we've talked about Saudi, we've talked about America. Just to get your thoughts a bit on, refined products. They've had a bit of a weak kind of run in terms of margins, refiners, etc., whether in Europe or in Asia. Any outlook for that going forward? There were some people commenting that we could see those sort of margins stabilize and perhaps a slightly stronger outlook going forward for refineries. What is the outlook for that from Argus's point of view?
Well, it really depends on the demand picture. We've got sub 1 million barrels a day of global products demand growth this year. China, as I said, is in contraction. At the same time, we've got a raft of new refining capacity that is sort of bunched around sort of 2023, 2024. So in a sense, you would have expected that combination to weigh pretty heavily on refining margins. When we look globally, we don't see over the next 3 to 4 years a major surplus of refining capacity. So we'd be a little bit more optimistic in terms of margins, as you say, stabilizing and potentially picking up a little bit over the next 18 to 24 months. But obviously, it depends very critically on levels of demand growth. We do have the specter of Chinese refined products export quotas, which have been relatively modest this year. But, that's something that could undermine margins in the Asia Pacific if the Chinese dialed up in terms of refined products exports. A lot of that new Chinese capacity, as you know, is designed to generate petchems, and really motor fuels are sort of an afterthought, and therefore, as we've seen with Chinese domestic demand for motor fuels and diesel, likely to remain relatively weak, that's a potential threat to margins in the Asia Pacific. But generally, we think margins are probably likely to be bottoming out this year.
Okay, but of course, very little of refining capacity globally coming on after in the second half of this decade. So again, those may remain supported. Thanks, David, for that. There's the result. 73% agree that it'll add pressure to maintain a specific oil price floor. That's kind of interesting. Frank, back to you. We have half a minute left. Just have you seen any evidence on the floor that, I mean, talking about China and its switch more and more to EVs and evidence of that? Have you seen a lot of evidence on the ground in Riyadh of electric vehicles, or what's the mood there?
There are lots of electric vehicles, but they're all Lucids, which, if you recall, is the American manufacturer in which the PIF has sunk billions of dollars of investment,
and which is not doing very well.
Well, no, but I tell you, it's certainly selling a lot in Saudi Arabia. It's the car of choice for executives to and from the Ritz-Carlton and the conference center here. So there are lots of those, but I haven't seen a single Tesla, for example. I don't think, and not many others. I mean, Saudis love petrol cars, so they haven't really.
Okay.
Would you mind if I just relate
please do close up for us? Yeah.
Short and funny story from FII.
Do.
Because Elon Musk, as I said, appeared via video on day one, and he was asked what he thought was the most pressing problem facing humanity, and he said it's aging and declining populations. Western countries in particular, they're simply running out of people. And he said, of course, I've been doing my personal bit to try to reverse that. Which got a huge belly laugh from the Saudi audience, given Musk's
yes,
numerous offspring,
absolutely,
shall we say? But they love that here.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Well, he's certainly gone off the rails a bit more than usual in the last few weeks, and is switching back and forth to whatever his preference might be. But we'll wait. We all hold our breath till next week, and this time in a week we will have a result in the US unless there's a dispute or an objection to it. And that could be another whole drama. But thank you so much to Frank Kane from Riyadh for joining us today from the conference. Pleasure. David and Robin, thanks again for your time, and have a great rest of the week, everyone. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, dear.
Thanks a lot. Bye now.
Bye-bye.